few brief administration announcements before we start. Would you please switch your phones to either silent or off? The toilet facilities are out the doors behind us and to your left. And in the occasion that we have to evacuate the building, again it's out the doors behind us, but to your right and up the ramp to the water feature on Liverpool Street. I'm Ron Lyons, I'm the Vice President of the Society, and I'm standing in today for our President, Rob Muscat. And I'd like to welcome you all to the Patrons Lecture for 2025. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to welcome two new members to the Society, Cheryl Day and Gary Woods. I'd also like to mention that we've moved to a new email system in the Society, and if you feel that you've not been receiving emails from us recently, please check your spam or junk folder on your email. And for those who may be wondering, I am standing up. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, our patron, Major General the Honourable Paul Brereton, AM, RFD, SC, and his subject is White Over Green, the 2nd 4th Australian Infantry Battalion, the final campaigns in New Guinea, from Hoane River to Mount Tazaki, 1945. I'm also pleased to welcome so many fellow members of the battalion here today. Paul is an Army Reservist and a leading jurist. Amongst his many military appointments, Paul was the commanding officer of the 4th 3rd Battalion, Royal New South Wales Regiment, which is the descendant battalion of the 2nd 4th, and the custodian of its many battle honours. Paul is also the Colonel Commandant of the Royal New South Wales Regiment and has been our patron for the last 12 years. He will take us through the 2nd 4th Battalion through the final battles in New Guinea, including the action at Wurrui Mission on the 14th of May 1945, where Private Edward Ned Kenner won the Victoria Cross. Would you please welcome our patron to the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see such an audience for this presentation and to see amongst you, and to be slightly fearful because amongst you there are many former commanding officers and soldiers of the 4th 3rd Battalion, which as Ron mentioned is the descendant of the 2nd 4th, all of whom probably know its history as well as I do and will be ready to pick up my mistakes. The chair is there not because I intend to sit, but because frankly I had a sudden drop in blood pressure 2 weeks ago, which caused me to suddenly faint, and I don't want to do that today, so just in case I need to sit down, which I trust I won't, the chair is there, and you're warm so you can come and catch me as I fall. Where's our board? On the 17th of May this year, the former Pheasant's Nest Hume motorway signage of Edward Kennebisi was presented to the Edward Kennebisi Other Ranks Mess in the Edward Kennebisi courtyard at the headquarters of the 4th 3rd Battalion of the Royal New South Wales Regiment at Sullivan. This marked the 80th anniversary, almost to the day, of Kenner's heroics on the 15th of May 1945 in the capture by the 2nd 4th Australian Infantry Battalion of Wurrui Mission near Wewak, for which he would receive the Victoria Cross. The Otterby Wewak campaign was the final Australian military campaign on mainland New Guinea. It ran from November 1944 to the war's end in August 1945. Dubbed one of the forgotten campaigns, fought by the 6th Australian Division, Australian Imperial Force, with air and naval support. Like all the jungle campaigns, it was challenging, and casualties mounted steadily from battle and more particularly from disease. Today I'll give an account of the feats of Kenna's battalion in that campaign. Before doing so, I'd acknowledge the sources on which I've drawn. Principally, the work of the former patron of this society and our predecessor as Colonel Commandant of the regiment, Major General Gordon Maitland's Battle History of the Royal New South Wales Regiment, Volume 2, 1939-1945. Most of you will be familiar with it, but it is a terrifically written work and a monumental part of our regimental history. In addition, Colonel Eustace Keogh's The South West Pacific, 1945, the 2nd 4th Battalion Association's History, White Over Green, General Maitland's Tales of Valour, and some personal correspondence with Edward Kenner's son, Mr. Rob Kenner, over the last couple of weeks following a presentation he made at the 4th Battalion Association function, which inspired me to seek some information from him, which will come a little later. But before we come to the Atape Wewak campaign, the story of the 2nd 4th Battalion has its origins 30 years earlier. The 4th Australian Infantry Battalion was among the first units raised for the AIF during the First World War, within a fortnight of the declaration of war. Like the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Battalions, it was recruited from New South Wales and together with those battalions constituted the 1st Brigade. The battalion embarked just 2 months after it was formed in late August, arriving in Egypt on the 2nd December 1914. It was in the Anzac Landing on 25 April 1915 as part of the 2nd and 3rd Waves. Its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel A.J.O. Thompson, was killed the next day. The battalion participated in the defence of the beachhead and in August, along with the rest of the 1st Brigade, led the charge at Lone Pine. Remained at Anzac continuously until the evacuation in December. After returning to Egypt, the 4th Battalion sailed for France in March 1916. Its first major action in France was at Pozières in July 1916. In 1918, the 4th Battalion helped stop the German Spring Offensive in March and April, and subsequently participated in the Great Allied Offensive of that year, east of Amiens, from the 8th of August 1918. It remained in operations until late September 1918, and its members returned to Australia between November 1918 and May 1919. At Gallipoli and on the Western Front, the 4th Battalion earned 23 battle honours, amongst them those depicted in this slide. With effect from 1 May 1921, the Australian Army was restructured along the lines of the AIF. The numerical designators, colour patches, battle honours and traditions of the units of the 1st AIF devolved on their reserve force successors. The 4th Battalion Australian Military Forces was created out of the 29th Australian Rifles and the 40th Infantry, and inherited the 4th Australian Infantry Battalion's 23 Great War battle honours and the white over green colour patch. In 1927 it was given the territorial title of the Australian Rifles, and for a time, just as it is today, it was linked with the 3rd Battalion. And that brings us to the formation of the 2nd 4th Australian Infantry Battalion, which was raised on the 3rd of November 1939 at Victoria Barracks, Sydney, as part of the 1st contingent for the 2nd AIF. The first drafts of recruits arrived at Ingleburn Camp shortly afterwards. Many of the initial volunteers had previous military experience in the reserve forces, with the first group of commissioned and non-commissioned officers all being sourced from New South Wales militia battalions, including the 4th, the 20th, 19th and the 56th battalions. Like the other infantry battalions of that day, it consisted of 4 rifle companies designated Alpha, Bravo, Charlie and Delta, under a headquarters company and a battalion headquarters. It had an authorised strength of around 900. Its colour patch was the same as that of the 4th Battalion of the 1st AIF, white over green, a horizontal rectangular shape, although a border of grey was added to distinguish the battalion from its militia counterpart. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Percival Parsons, a World War I veteran who'd served in the militia between the wars, the battalion began training at Inglewood. By early 1940, the battalion was ready to deploy overseas, and on the 4th of January took part in a march through the streets of Sydney to farewell it. Less than a week later, on the 10th of January 1940, the battalion sailed from Sydney aboard Strathnaver, arriving in Egypt on the 14th of February. Initially, the 2nd, 4th, along with the 2nd, 1st, 2nd, 2nd and 2nd, 3rd battalions, all from New South Wales, formed the 16th Brigade, which was assigned to the 6th Division. Following the reorganisation, with each infantry brigade reduced from 4 battalions to 3, the battalion was reallocated to the 19th Brigade, still in the 6th Division. This slide depicts the divisional organisation after the reorganisation. This reorganisation occurred while the battalion was at sea, and after arriving in the Middle East, it concentrated at a camp near Gaza, where it joined the 2nd, 8th and 2nd, 11th battalions, and undertook further training and exercises in Egypt and Palestine. Then it was committed to its first campaign against the Italians in eastern Libya. The 2nd, 4th played a small role at Bardia on the 3rd to the 5th of January 1941, and a larger one during the Battle of Tobruk, 21-22 January, and featured in the capture of the Wadi Derna on 27 to 30 January. It was the first Australian unit to enter Benghazi on the 6th of February, and subsequently garrisoned that town until the 22nd of February. By now it was under the command of the redoubtable Lieutenant Colonel, later Major General Sir Ivan Doherty. In early April 1941, with the rest of the 6th Division, the battalion was deployed to Greece, where it fought a fierce defensive battle at Vevae on the 11th and 12th of April, and then withdrew through a series of rearguard positions until evacuated by sea on the 26th of April. Next day it landed at Crete, and eventually joined the force defending Heraklion airfield. When German paratroops landed on the 20th of May, they were rapidly overcoming the area around the airfield, but they were able to gain a foothold elsewhere, and that, combined with German successes elsewhere on Crete, brought about the evacuation of Heraklion by sea on the 29th of May. But then, after a period of training in Palestine, the battalion joined the force garrisoning Syria, completing that duty in mid-January 1942. Japan having entered the war, the 2nd, 4th embarked for home on the 12th of February and arrived in Adelaide on the 27th of March. In the Middle East, it had earned the battle honours listed on this slide. At the time when I was commanding officer of the 4th, 3rd, we were headquartered at Ingleburn in the lines where the battalion had been raised, and those lines were named Heraklion lines. While other elements of the 6th Division were sent to New Guinea in late 1942 and early 1943 and saw combat along the Kokoda track and around Wau, the 19th Brigade was allocated to defensive duties in the Northern Territory. After a fortnight's leave in late May 1942, The 2nd Fourth was ordered north from its temporary location near Mount Lofty in South Australia to Darwin, where they remained until June 1943. Then the battalion was moved to northern Queensland to join the rest of the 19th Brigade as the 16th and 17th Brigades returned to Australia from New Guinea. This plaque at Wundekla on the Atherton tablelands marks the divisional area of the 6th Division, including the 19th Brigade. A long period of training ensued as the division was reconstituted. Eventually, the 6th Division was committed to relieve the Americans in Italy from November 1944. The 2nd Fourth Battalion embarked for New Guinea aboard United States Army Transport City of Mexico on 28th of October 1944 and landed at Idaho on the 31st of October. Perhaps that would no longer be called the City of Mexico, but the City of America. Following the Australian victories at Sanamau, Ley and Finchaven, American forces had bypassed the Japanese 18th Army base at Wewak in early 1944, taking Idaho, developing a base there and repulsing a major Japanese attack. The Americans were content to hold Idaho and not advance far towards Wewak. As preparations began for the drive to the north through the Philippines, it was decided that defence of the area would be passed to Australian forces to release the American troops that General MacArthur wanted to use elsewhere. In mid-1944, MacArthur secured an agreement from the Australian government for Australian forces to take over Idaho. On the 12th of July, he issued a directive to General Wayne providing for a redistribution of forces in the Southwest Pacific to enable forces to continue the offensive. That directive included that Australian forces should assume responsibility for the continued neutralisation of the Japanese in the Northern Solomons from the 1st of October 1944, and in New Britain and Australian New Guinea from the 1st of November 1944. Blamey allocated this task to the 1st Australian Army under Lieutenant General Sturdy. His instructions to Sturdy of the 11th of August included to relieve the United States forces at Idaho, defend the airstrip and base area, and by patrol activity maintain contact with the enemy in Wewak, but the commitment of major forces was to be avoided. This was presumably because it was then still contemplated the 6th Division would be required further afield. The most significant topographical feature in the Idaho-Wewak area is the continuous coastal dividing range formed by the Torricelli and Prince Alexander ranges, running roughly parallel to the coast with their peaks on average 20 kilometres inland. Towards the east, they converge to within 6 kilometres of Wewak and meet the coast a little further east. Averaging from 1,500 metres in height, they consist of a very rugged and steep system of heavily wooded ridges intersected by deep gorges. Their northern slopes pitch steeply down to the narrow coastal plain. The coastal plains are low-lying, swampy, heavily wooded, and intersected by numerous streams liable to flood. It was sparsely populated. On the southern side of the mountains, however, they slope gradually into the Sea Peak River Valley, eventually into lightly wooded grasslands which support many native villages and produced a fairly abundant supply of food. After being defeated at Idaho, General Adachi established his headquarters at Wewak. Of his 3 divisions, 51st was also headquartered at Wewak, with troops deployed on the coastal belt between Carroll Rock and the Seapack River. 20 Division was headquartered at Boot, with units dispersed in the areas Boot, Dagua, Maprick. 41st Division was west of the Anna River from the coast to Banff. Although Allied intelligence estimated Adachi's strength to be between 24,000 and 30,000, it was actually close to 35,000. But the army was in pretty poor shape. It had suffered heavy casualties and was short of ammunition and had no medical supplies. Virtually no supplies were reaching it except via the occasional submarine, and the troops were living off the land. They endured great hardships, were in rags, undernourished and ridden with disease, and had no immediate prospect of improvement in their condition. Sturdy's Operation Instruction of 18 October to Major General J.E.G. Stevens, commanding 6th Division, was somewhat more ambitious than those he had received from Blamey. He tasked the 6th Division not only to defend the airfield and radar installation in the Aitape area and to prevent movement westward of Japanese forces, but also to seize every opportunity for the destruction of those forces. After establishing themselves in Aitape, 19th Brigade was initially tasked with securing the area to the east around the Drinamore, Danmap and Danubi rivers. The 2nd 4th Battalion secured the vicinity of the Danubi River mouth. The Drinamore River mouth. On the 12th of November, they commenced to move further east to Babiang. This image shows Alpha Company crossing the Nijia River on the 17th of November. There, the going looks easy, but in many places it was extremely difficult as the Japanese had felled coconut palms across the sand at 3-metre intervals. Then the battalion undertook a vigorous patrolling campaign, with the result that by 15 December, no Japanese remained west of the Danmap River. General Stevens then proposed to cut the Abao Marlin Wallen Aman track, which the Japanese were using as a line of communications between their troops in the coastal area and the food producing areas south of the ranges, and to destroy the enemy on the coast between the Danmap River and Malin. This plan was approved by Sturdy and Blamey. The 2nd 4th crossed the Danmap River on the 17th of December. It was in high flood with a very strong current, yet there was only a very minor loss of equipment, a remarkable achievement. Between then and the 23rd of December, there were a number of engagements in which the battalion lost 11 killed in action and 16 wounded. Meanwhile, it inflicted 98 enemy killed in action, 9 enemy wounded, and captured 5 prisoners. The 19th Brigade continued eastward against minor opposition, and by 19th of January, the objectives had been secured without any major action, though there were some brisk minor engagements. On the 24th of January, 19th Brigade was relieved by 16th Brigade and returned to securing the defensive position in Aitape. Towards the end of January, General Stevens sought permission to engage in a more vigorous offensive to destroy the enemy in the Weemuck area. Although told by Sturdy to avoid a major engagement since no reinforcements or additional resources were available, on 15 February he issued an operation instruction stating his intention to be to capture Boot, Dagua and Weemuck. On the 17th of March, 16th Brigade occupied Boot, and on 21 March cleared Dagua, where Lieutenant Albert Chown of the 2nd Australian Infantry Battalion, who had earlier received a military medal, known to posthumous Victoria Cross, on the 25th of March. Meanwhile, to secure the right flank, the 15th Brigade had advanced through Bailiff to Maprick and reached the Nenad River by the end of March. Logistics were presenting ever-increasing difficulties, and if the Americans were to withdraw more aircraft for use in the Philippines, the division would have had to withdraw to Artipi. The alternative was to continue to Wewak, capture of which would enable Stevens to avoid the long and tenuous line of communication back to Artipi. On the 19th of March, Blamey visited the area and decided that the advance to Wewak would be continued. And so on the 7th of April, General Stevens ordered Brigadier King, Commander 16th Brigade, to take Karawap and Boykin and establish a bridgehead over the Hawaiian River. These tasks were achieved, as depicted on this map, by the 2nd 1st, 2nd 2nd and 2nd 3rd Battalions. On the 27th of April, the 2nd 2nd Battalion assumed the lead and crossed the Hawaiian River. By now, the 16th Brigade had been in action for more than 3 months. On the 2nd of May, 19th Brigade took over the advance with orders issued on the 27th of April to destroy the enemy in the Cape Wom Yarrabos area, clear the enemy from Ranimboa, seize the tracks south of the Lurui mission, and destroy the enemy in the area around Wewak Point, Cape Moan. On the 3rd of May, the 2nd 4th Battalion advanced forward from the Hawaiian River, led by its Delta Company and supported by a troop of the 2nd 4th Armour Regiment. Progress of approximately 10 kilometres was achieved, despite an engagement in which 5 Japanese were killed in action. The following day, the battalion reached Cape Wom and by nightfall had patrols on the Wurundjeri River. And so the Australian advance closed on Wewak in early May 1945. Wewak was the last sea-based fortress of the Japanese in New Guinea. By this time, the Japanese strength there was estimated as being up to 1,000 personnel from the headquarters of the 51st Division, the 66th and 102nd Regiments, and the 25th Airfield Battalion. As described in the battalion history, Wewak, which is viewed in this slide from the southeast of Wurui mission to which we shall return, was going to be a hard nut to crack. It jutted out 2,000 yards, 1,800 metres from a low-lying coastline, and was like Gibraltar in miniature. Only one approach for the attack was possible, along the 20-yard, 18-metre wide strip of sand, which was limited to one side by the sea and merging into tangled mangroves on the other. The point was fringed with coral reef, and at sea level was a narrow shelf on which a road was built, coral cliffs rising sheerly beside the road, making a plateau of the point. Controlling the approaches was a narrow coral knoll approximately 8 feet high, 2.5 metres, and running east-west. This feature in turn was overlooked from the high ground overlooking the plateau. The enemy had taken full advantage of the dominating ground and sighted weapons in such a way as to make an attack appear suicidal. Pillboxes were blasted into the coral face and reinforced with concrete, while bunkers built in the open were protected with as much as 6 feet, 2 metres of overhead cover. Huge caves had been dug into the cliffs, in some cases to a depth of 200 feet, 60 metres, with smaller caves linked by subterranean passages. In some instances, the caves were strengthened with concrete to a depth of 12 feet, 3.5 metres, and based with timber supports. That terrain dictated that the attack had to be entrusted to a single battalion. The sea, the river and the swamps precluded the deployment of more. This would be the 2nd 4th, and it was a challenging task. Despite the availability of aerial photography, the new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Cox, could ascertain little about the dispositions on the approaches, and even less about the defences in the town. Patrols reconnoitred the defences, in particular to see whether Maple Creek, just short of Wewak Point, was defended. By the end of 7 May, Captain Smith's Alpha Company had occupied Yarros. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Germany surrendered and the war in Europe came to an end. On the 8th of May, following the bombing of the peninsula by 12 boaters, Bravo Company, supported by artillery, tanks, mortars, machine guns and flamethrowers, crossed Minga Creek, depicted in this slide, in assault boats, and secured a 270 metre deep beachhead, where it came under small arms fire and then fire from a 70mm gun, which continued throughout the night, killing 4 and causing numerous casualties. With intelligence indicating that the Japanese were abandoning Wewak to withdraw into the Prince Alexander Mountains, Colonel Cox gave his orders for the attack to take place on the 10th of May, after breakfast on the 9th of May, using a mud model built by the intelligence section, which was also used later in the day by subordinate commanders to familiarise themselves with the terrain. During the afternoon, the battalion was concentrated near a bridge which the engineers had already constructed over Minga Creek for the tanks to cross. HR was initially set for 0523 on the 10th of May, but visibility was so impaired for the tanks by heavy rain and the darkness that it was deferred until 0610. The quartermaster ensured all troops received a hot breakfast. The history does not disclose whether, as at Bardia, they received rum. The preparatory bombardment commenced at 0555. On HR, Captain Hawke's Delta Company and the tanks of 13 Troop of the 2nd 4th Armoured Regiment crossed the line of departure. Captain Atkinson's Bravo Company and its support tanks from 14 Troop followed 10 minutes later. This image depicts troops from the 2nd 4th Battalion attacking around Wewak with tank support that day. Despite the artillery barrage of 2,700 rounds, Delta Company immediately came under fire from a heavy machine gun in a pillbox, firing straight down the track across the isthmus. The ground prevented any deployment to the flanks, but with the skillful use of covering fire, and especially from the tanks which suppressed the machine gun, they managed to get forward. Once on solid ground, the company deployed, and with the tanks helping to destroy strong points, overran its objectives. Meanwhile, Bravo Company came under heavy fire from numerous caves in the escarpment of Wewak Point. Again, with the support of the tanks, each of the caves was cleared, and by 0800, the whole of Wewak Point had been captured. Alpha and Charlie companies were then brought forward to do the mopping up, which was extensive, including many pillboxes and caves. Many of the Japanese strong points were located in deep caves and had to be dealt with by the tanks or with flamethrowers, and some fell only at bayonet point. This image is of a section of C Company that day. By nightfall, enemy resistance in Wewak had ceased, although numerous small parties of Japanese troops sought to escape through the Australian positions after dark. 5 Australians and up to 2,000 Japanese were killed in the fighting for Wewak. So up to 200 Japanese were killed in the fighting for Wewak. The capture of Wewak Point by a single battalion was a truly conspicuous feat of arms. Following an inspection of the fortress afterwards, Blamey described its capture as a highlight of the New Guinea campaign and a magnificent achievement brought about by courage and detailed planning. The battalion's medical officer, Captain Williams, who tragically was later to be killed in action at Mount Tazaki, after describing the strength of the defences, wrote of the men of his battalion, "They just moved straight through it all. Their very courage, discipline and training carried them on to their objectives." On the afternoon of the 11th of May, the battalion wheeled inland towards Wewak Airfield where it came under artillery and machine gun fire from Wirrawee Mission. Wewak Airfield was captured on the 12th of May. The battalion's next major task would be the capture of Wirrawee Mission, a former Lutheran mission station built on top of a 91-metre hill which dominated the airstrip, and its dominating position is indicated by the earlier slide, this photograph being taken from that mission. On the 14th of May, Commander 19th Brigade Brigadier Martin ordered the 2nd Force to take Wirrawee Mission. By noon, Colonel Cox had issued orders for a 3-phase leapfrogging attack for the afternoon of the 14th of May. Charlie Company was to take the first feature, the intermediate feature, roughly the vicinity of the upper right of the 3 blue circles marked on that map. Alpha Company was then to pass through and take the second objective, the main Wirrawee feature, which is the bottom of the 3 blue circles. Finally, Bravo Company would then capture what was called the pimple or the bump feature, a small knoll on the western end of the feature, being the upper left of the 3 blue circles. Following an artillery bombardment, Charlie Company attacked just after 2 p.m. While opposition was relatively light, the heat was stifling and visibility limited. The tall Guinea grass on the hill made the going slow and the Japanese bunkers hard to locate. But the company secured its objective within half an hour. Alpha Company then passed through it. Its company commander, Captain Smith, was dissatisfied with the preparatory bombardment and required it to be repeated. The company then advanced, encountering little opposition, and carried the assault onto the mission, which it secured just after 3 p.m. So basically less than an hour for H.O. But due to the late hour, it was suggested by Captain Smith and agreed by Colonel Cox that Alpha Company should proceed to take Bravo Company's objective, the pimple. But very stubborn resistance was encountered from the pimple. Little headway was made against well-sighted bunkers. At nightfall, Alpha Company was ordered to hold where it was. Resuming the attack the next morning, Alpha Company continued to make slow progress against the bunkers on the bump. An artillery barrage was called down on the bunkers. Then 8 platoon was sent forward to renew the attack. Corporal Neve's 5 section was to give covering fire, while the other 2 sections assaulted. But it was impossible to find an effective supporting position due to the exposure and the thick Guinea grass. Meanwhile, a previously unlocated Japanese machine gun opened fire, wounding 2 men and pinning down the 2 assaulting sections of the platoon. This difficult situation was resolved by the actions of Private Edward and Ned Kenner, who'd been posted to the 2nd Force on the 3rd of September 1943 when it was training in the Atherton Tailings. At this point, on his own initiative and without orders, Kenner stood up in full view of the enemy less than 50 yards away and engaged the bunker, firing his Bren gun from the hip. The enemy machine gun immediately returned fire, and with such accuracy that bullets actually passed between his arms and body. Undeterred, he remained completely exposed and continued to fire at the enemy until his magazine was exhausted. Still a target, he said to a comrade, "They have a bead on me, pass me a rifle." Another soldier passed his rifle up, and despite the intense machine gun fire, Kenner, with amazing coolness, killed the gunner with his first round. He then took up the Bren again, and still standing, engaged a heavy machine gun which had been firing from a position 70 yards away to the left. The citation for his Victoria Cross concludes, the result of Private Kenner's magnificent bravery in the face of concentrated fire was that the bunker was captured without further loss and the company attack proceeded to a successful conclusion, many enemy being killed and numerous automatic weapons captured. There is no doubt that the success of the company attack would have been seriously endangered and many casualties sustained, but for Private Kenner's magnificent courage and complete disregard for his own safety. His action was an outstanding example of the highest degree of bravery. This image is a Japanese photograph of the gun that Kenner would subsequently engage. Today, that gun is located at the southern depot of the 4th Battalion. Kenner's was not the only conspicuous gallantry at Wirrawee mission. Captain Smith would receive a military cross for his leadership and personal bravery during the attack. The Second Force's history acknowledges that without his personal courage in exposing himself to enemy fire, to assess and to arrest the course of the attack, and the skill with which he organised it, A Company would have come out of the attack with heavier casualties than it in fact did. Following the action at Wirrawee mission, the battalion continued clearance operations. It captured Koigan in the foothills of the Prince Alexander Range on the 25th of May. On the 28th of May, General Stevens ordered 19th Brigade to capture Mounts Tesaki and Shiburangu. Topical graphical challenges involved in that will be clear enough from the contours on this map. They precluded the use of tanks. On the 5th of June, Alpha Company of the 2nd 4th, the covering platoon from Charlie Company, moved out along the track to attack a strong Japanese position on the steep northern spur of Mount Kwakabu on the approaches to Mount Tasaki. An artillery concentration was laid on the objective, and then Alpha Company advanced up the steep spur leading to the position. Good progress was made until about 40 metres short of the position, when it was seen that the large knoll at the top of the spur was bounded by sheer re-entrance on the east and west. The enemy opened fire with rifles and several automatic weapons. With 7 and 9 platoons providing covering fire, Lieutenant Eric Whiteside led his 8th platoon forward up the only approach, throwing grenades to gain the enemy positions. Once again, Kenner dashed forward to engage from the cover of a fallen tree. But as he set up to return fire, he was engaged from a previously unsighted position and hit in the lower face and neck, tearing flesh down to his shoulder and exiting out his chest. At this point, Lieutenant Whiteside ran forward, throwing grenades, and pushed Kenner aside to take up the position behind the break. However, not knowing where the fresh engagement was coming from, Whitehouse too was hit. The position was gained, but Whiteside died of his wounds the following day. Another soldier, Private Andrews, was killed in action, and in addition to Kenner, 5 others were wounded. Kenner survived and lived till he was 90. Whitehouse paid the ultimate price and did not come home. According to his son Robert, Kenner years later said with great emotion, "Only for Whitey, I would have copped the next burst, so I owe my life to him. That's the way war goes." Robert took this to show that even Victoria Cross recipients can have their own heroes. He relates that Kenner always said of his Victoria Cross, "Actually, it isn't mine. I wear it for all who fought side by side in all campaigns." Interviewed about his VC action for the Australians at War Film Archive in 2002, Kenner said, It's just one of those things that you do. I suppose it's hard to say. I think anyone would have gone down the same thing in the same position. Because, well, it's no good laying down there and doing nothing. You had to do something, and I don't think the Nibs would have bought tea or dinner for me, so I had to get up and do something. And I honestly think that any soldier would have done the same thing. I had the privilege of meeting Kenner when I was commanding officer, when he visited the depot in Sutherland on occasion. There will be many others here who also met Ned, who was a remarkable man. He would never come to the sergeant's mess or to the officer's mess, and always insisted on drinking only in the soldiers' club. And that was so even when he went to the United Kingdom on a VC visit, when he was made an honorary sergeant so that he could be admitted to the sergeant's mess, but he declined. Ultimately, responsibility for the capture of Mount Shibarangu was allocated to the 2nd 8th Battalion. The 2nd 4th were to take Mount Tasaki. Colonel Cox carried out an aerial reconnaissance in a Wirraway of the approaches to Mount Tasaki and identified the best, which would not otherwise have been found. On the 19th of June, Delta Company captured the approach spur against strong opposition. After aggressive patrolling and probing, the final attack on Mount Tasaki was launched at 0800 on the 22nd of June, preceded by what was described as a terrific artillery pounding. It caused great destruction and made a chaotic tangle of fallen trees, branches and vines. Rain bucketed down, turning the earth to mud. Charlie Company passed many blown-in bunkers with dead occupants before being engaged only about 180 metres from the objective. But at that point, fire from 3 tricky machine guns and numerous snipers became very effective. The rear platoon tried to outflank to the left, but it too encountered resistance. The company was withdrawn to enable another 525-pound shells to be laid on the objective, following which the company succeeded in fighting up and securing the position. Delta Company then moved through and captured another stronghold. After some further fighting on the afternoon of 24th of June, the summit of Mount Tasaki was captured. That would be the 2nd 4th's last major action. On the 5th of July, Prime Minister John Curtin died. On the 15th of August, when word was received that the war with Japan was over, Colonel Cox declared all work cancelled for the day and everyone gathered around the Salvation Army wireless, which was the captain appointed every news broadcast. The news, announced from time to time during the day, was heard in silence. Men who were eligible for discharge began returning to Australia in drafts after September. The remainder of the battalion arrived home on the 26th of October, and the 2nd 4th Battalion was disbanded at Chermside in Queensland on the 12th of November 1945. During its service, a total of 2,624 men served with the battalion, of whom 94 were killed in action, 24 wounded, and 195 taken prisoner. In addition to Kenner's Victoria Cross, members of the battalion also received 1 Distinguished Service Order, 9 military crosses, 6 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 11 military medals, and 53 mentions in dispatches. 2 members of the battalion were appointed members of the Order of the British Empire, the then equivalent of a member of the Order of Australia. Wee-Wack was an arduous, frustrating and costly campaign. The 6th Division suffered 1,583 battle casualties, 442 killed and 1,141 wounded in action in that campaign. but it also incurred a total of 16,203 non-battle casualties due to malaria, scrub typhus and the like. The 6 battle honours earned during the campaign by the New South Wales infantry battalions, depicted on this slide, and the campaign honour Liberation of Australia New Guinea, have been inherited, along with the traditions of those battalions, by the Royal New South Wales Regiment. Like the battle honours of the 1st AIF, and like those earned by the predecessor battalions in the Middle East, this I regard as a sacred trust. The military historian Colonel Eustace Keogh argues that there were very few military reasons to support the campaign. The Japanese couldn't mount an offensive and showed no sign or intent of doing so. Their defeat on the macro scale was now almost certain and would be decided elsewhere. There was no need to do anything more than contain it. Neither the government nor the people of the United States were likely to be impressed by this quite unimportant to them mopping up campaign while the decision was being won by their own troops elsewhere. Yet the campaign drew resources and, more importantly, cost limbs and lives. Politically or strategically, he concludes, the offences at Itape-Wewak served no useful purpose and achieved nothing that could not have been achieved at far less cost. The competing views presented by our former patron, General Maitland, who points out that despite the probability of victory, ultimately it still seemed a long way off. Nothing was then known of the atomic bomb, and indeed with their V2 rocket the Germans appeared to have a scientific edge and were having some success with their counter-offensive in the Ardennes. The alternative of the Australian Army confining itself to already captured areas and living alongside the Japanese on the north coast of New Guinea was a militarily objectionable concept which would have become totally unacceptable while the British in Burma and the Americans in the Pacific were involved in very heavy fighting to push the Japanese back. Australia also had a responsibility to free its mandated territories from enemy occupation, to relieve cruelly treated natives and prisoners from Japanese oppression, and to remain engaged on a sufficient scale to be assured an effective voice in the peace settlement. Regardless of one's views on this debate, what matters today is that the soldiers of the 2nd 4th Australian Infantry Battalion, along with others of the 6th Division, even though some of them even then doubted the utility of what they were being asked to do, and even though some of them were disheartened by seeing their long-standing comrades who had served sincerely in the war sadly killed in this campaign, nonetheless resolutely and courageously pursued their mission in most arduous and difficult conditions against a skillful and determined if weakened enemy. All this punctuated with notable acts of valour and conspicuous feats of arms. This memorial to the 2nd 4th is an upper bound on the Atherton tablelands, and it seems fitting to conclude with it. This is where it's difficult.
Okay. Yes,
Here we go.
How important do the battalion with the colour patches? I should have put that in the plural. It seems to me, from looking at some of those slides, they were just worn on the hats, not steel helmets, interestingly enough.
I think, yeah.
I don't think they had them on the shoulders, did
No, they didn't. I don't think they had them. I think you're quite right. They didn't have them on the shoulders. First of all, they were worn on the shoulders. I'm pretty sure there were maybe they were worn on the shoulders in the First War.
And also the second one, only on the service dress, not on the jungle green shirts.
My impression is that they were important not so much for recognition purposes, because I think at that point the soldiers knew each other and knew who they were and who was meant to be where. So they weren't there for recognition purposes, but they were a key part of the battalion esprit, morale and ethos. And that the very fact that many of the battalion histories, just as the history of this battalion is called white over green, the 3rd Battalion is not called by its colour patch, it's called Warlands. But many of the battalions refer to themselves by the colours on their colour patch. Today, for many years colour patches weren't used after the Second World War. Their reintroduction linked today's battalions with their predecessors in a recognisable way, and I think from the esprit de corps perspective, they were regarded as very important.
Yeah, in terms of the impression of MacArthur, obviously going to Gurkha, what was the attitude of the Australian troops towards MacArthur, and particularly with the Americans fighting in Guinea, etc.?
I don't think there was much love lost between the Australian troops and the Americans. On the one hand, it was recognised that ultimately, for a number of years, our security depended on the Americans. There was certainly no love lost between Blamey and MacArthur, but nor was there much love lost between Blamey and some of his subordinate Australian generals. And this relates more to the end of the Dakota campaign and Boonagoa and Salamander, but I don't think the Americans won themselves many admirers amongst the Australians for their performance at that time. There were exceptions, but yeah, bottom line is I don't think there was a great deal of admiration amongst Australian troops for MacArthur.
What was the background of the junior officers and probably more importantly the senior NCOs in the battalion? Because obviously they weren't professional soldiers, but they were
civilian-wise, very diverse, but the backbone of the battalion were militia officers who'd served in the New South Wales infantry battalions between the war, or militia officers and NCOs. And on other occasions, I've commented that Australia owes an enormous debt of gratitude to those who came back from the Western Front and from 1921 served on in the militia and either directly re-enlisted or at least through their education and training taught the people who would become the skeleton of our army in 1940.
From the pictures, the maps, we're basically operating on almost the seashore. What was the other services support of the army during this campaign?
So they had some reasonable air support. I referred at one point to the strike on Murdoch Point by 12 Beauforts, but that wasn't the only instance. So they had aerial support from light to medium bombers in the form of Beauforts. They also had some fighter support because some of the reporting does refer to strafing of positions occasionally, and they had transport support. I don't know the precise details of that. I imagine Dakotas, but the real concern was if that air transport support was withdrawn to support the Philippines, then the lines of communication from ITP forward would be unsustainable. Navally, I don't recall reading. There was an amphibious landing at Boot, but I don't recall reading of any significant naval support.
Who's responsible now for the battalion colours and how are they stored?
I think St Anne's Church at Homebush. Warren?
They've been moved to Canberra.
Okay, they've been relocated to Canberra.
First off, I'd just like to say excellent presentation.
Thank you so much.
Secondly, I'm a young person, and I'm just in my early 20s, and I wanted to ask your opinion on this matter. I didn't know anything about this campaign. I mean, I know of the New Guinea campaign, but not much about what happened in it. And I was wondering to get your opinion on how do we maintain the memory of this campaign and keep it alive for future generations, in your opinion? And how do we emphasize the importance of it?
What a great question. Whenever I do these presentations, whether it be this annual presentation or when we organise things through the regiment for the regimental weekend, I try to look back at something that has happened on a relevant anniversary. So this 80 years on from Wewak was a really good opportunity to do that. But I think it's partly through this sort of activity of remembering them when we have opportunities to speak about history. It would be good to see the war memorials rotate a few presentations through, so featured presentations, so maybe one year they will obviously feature on an anniversary of Anzac. Maybe one year we can either here or in Canberra feature the Wewak campaign. Would be a good way of doing that. This gets a little bit of recognition because obviously the two Victoria Crosses, both won by members of the New South Wales battalions, Chow and Kenner, obviously are up there in the League of Heroes, and that attracts some attention to this campaign, which even then might otherwise not get. So, it's not just a question, you've asked, it's a suggestion, and it's a really good one, and I'm certainly going to take it on board.
Why was there no movement support? You would have thought that would have been ideal backup for them.
I don't know, but I suspect.
Up with the Americans in the Philippines, the Australian Navy was up there, Battle of Leyte Gulf, etc.
And they were also, towards the end of this, they're also preparing for Borneo, which is the largest Australian amphibious operation since Anzac. So I suspect that was it.
I think you're probably looking really only at coastal shipping, little coastal freighters with perhaps some air cover. Okay, thank you very much. Paul, thank you on behalf